Hi, I'm back with part two of lecture, and I'm going to talk here about pan movements, and specifically the UNIA, to give some context for your document on Marcus Garvey and his call, his advertisement for the Black Star Line. Pan-Africanism, which Garvey was an advocate of, was one of multiple pan movements that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These pan movements sought to link people who were across state boundaries, sought to link a nation that had been scattered. These pan movements often sought both an independent or enlarged homeland, as well as better treatment for members of this scattered nation, wherever they were. Many of these peoples were considered national minorities where they were, and were often confronted with prejudice and legal discrimination. So pan movements were an attempt to establish and define communities and identities dependent on a place of common origin. They were often based on some definition of ethnicity or religion. As I say, pan movements desire new states, independent states, or the enlargement of existing ones. I'll give you an example. Zionism was a pan movement beginning in the 1890s that sought to, first of all, Zionists wanted an independent Jewish nation state, a refuge for Jews. This was done in part in the belief that Jews could not be equal to non-Jews in Europe. Part of the logic of desiring an independent Jewish nation state was people thought it would also encourage better treatment of Jews in wherever they were. For instance, you can see the ad there on this PowerPoint, "Help Him Build Palestine." That is an example of a Zionist appeal. And you can see in the picture, it's somebody digging. Jews in many places in Europe had not been allowed to own land, had not been able to be farmers. And so it's a powerful appeal here in this picture that it's significant that the person is shown working the land. The land and homeland was a key part of appeal and goal of pan movements. And one of the significant things about pan movements is how they threatened, in different ways, empires, colonial states, and nation states. So, sticking with Zionism again, many American Jews in the early 20th century were very wary of Zionism, did not consider themselves Zionists. They feared that embracing Zionism would lead to them being accused of having dual loyalties. One of the reasons why pan movements are threatening to nation states is they question the exclusive hold on citizens that nation states presume to have, and calling into question citizens' loyalties by suggesting they have a truer homeland elsewhere. Pan movements were also threatening to empires. You can see in the upper right of this PowerPoint slide a map of ethnic groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1910. And if you look at the red areas, those are areas where German ethnicity was predominant. And people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who were part of the pan-German political movement believed that they should not be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multinational empire, but instead they should be part of a greater Germany. They should be part of the German nation state. Germany should expand to include them. And in that way, pan movements could also be threatening to empires. Probably the most significant example of how pan movements threatened empire was the Black Hand. You can see there at the bottom of the slide, there is an image that was the symbol of the Black Hand and a map of Bosnia and Serbia. And there, the Black Hand was a pan-Slavic group that wanted a greater Serbia. They wanted a Serbia that encompassed Serbs in the region. There were many Serbs in Bosnia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And out of frustration, the Black Hand is a terrorist organization that assassinates the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the heir to the throne, in 1914. And this, of course, is what helps lead to World War I. And so in this very real way, not just theoretically, but in this very real way, this pan movement desires a greater homeland for Serbs, ends up destabilizing the European system, ends up destabilizing this multinational empire of the Austro-Hungarian Empire with its desire for a greater homeland. So pan movements were threatening in these multiple kinds of ways to both empires and nation states. And the Pan-African movement also could be seen as threatening. It was certainly an anti-imperialist movement, as it sought, as people engaged in Pan-Africanism, desired both better treatment for peoples of African descent wherever they were, as well as ultimately an independent Africa, an Africa with independent states within it. So the Pan-African movement really begins to acquire a more formal organization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The goal of Pan-Africanists was to foster development of an African-wide identity. And it was an attempt to link all people of African descent, either on the African continent or those residing in the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and elsewhere. It was seen as a vehicle for regenerating and unifying Africa. And the idea of this idea really contributed to the development of African nationalism and anti-colonial organizations, the appeal of a Pan-African identity. It was a social and political resistance movement and ideology that challenged the effects of colonization. You can see that the Pan-African Association in 1897 was one of the first meetings that brought together people from different parts of the world. The Pan-African Association sought to secure civil and political rights for Africans throughout the world, for people of African descent throughout the world. Also sought to encourage industrial and commercial enterprise among people of African descent, to produce information and statistics about peoples of Africa and African descent, and to establish, in the end, a united front of independent black African states. While independent African states was the goal of many Pan-Africanists, they also were willing to work within colonial structures in the early 20th century. And so the Pan-African Association and Pan-African conferences lobbied colonial governments, such as the British government in Africa, to protect native Africans' interests, respect their customs, create industrial schools, and teach a, quote, true and simple Christianity. You can see that the first Pan-African Conference is in London in 1900, which brings together delegates from Europe, the West Indies, the United States, and Africa. Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, which is founded in 1914 by Garvey and his wife Amy Garvey, was a very popular manifestation of Pan-Africanism, and one that moved beyond kind of elites in societies and was embraced by a much larger portion of the population. Garvey's organization was known as a working class organization. And I'm now on the slide entitled Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Garvey is a Jamaican who immigrates to the United States in the mid-1910s, moves to New York, and begins this organization that promotes African liberation and self-determination, as well as black economic self-reliance and what at the time was called race pride. The UNIA sought to establish very much a pan-national identity, and with chapters not just in the United States, but in Africa and in the Caribbean and Latin America as well. As part of the organization, had a newspaper known as the Negro World that was published not only in English, but also had Spanish and French language pages within. And this newspaper was seen as subversive by authorities in the United States, as well as Latin America and African colonies. Authorities in all those places attempted to disrupt and stop its circulation. The UNIA, as I mentioned, sponsored strikes in Latin America, as it notes on the PowerPoint. For instance, supporting United Fruit workers who worked for the United Fruit Company in Guatemala when they went on strike for higher wages. So that was one way in which they were disruptive of established economic relations in different places. The UNIA, as you can see at the top of the slide, held international conferences in the early 1920s. In 1920, the UNIA had more than 1,000 chapters in 40 countries, with an estimated 1 million participants in this movement that championed, as I mentioned, black economic self-reliance, race pride, and African liberation and self-determination. In other words, that African peoples should be free to determine their governments, should be independent. 1920, the UNIA, as I say, has its first international convention, at which, and during this time, the convention's held in New York. There are very frequent parades in the city. And Garvey, at this convention, is elected provisional president of Africa. And this was interesting because one of the reasons why it's interesting is that it demonstrated some of the tensions within the Pan-African movement. Some Pan-Africanists questioned Garvey's desire to build an African empire, believed that being president of a continent spoke to his own imperialist ambitions. Others thought that Africans themselves would not accept a president who was not initially from Africa. That if there was to be a provisional president of Africa, that person should have been born in Africa. On to the next slide, entitled The Black Star Line Steamship Company. One of the ideas that really caught people's attention, that really caught their fancy, was Garvey's idea for a Black Star Line steamship company. A company that, in Garvey's vision, would facilitate trade between American ports and those of Africa, the West Indies, and Central and South America. And the Black Star Line is founded in 1919. And Garvey and the UNIA advertised and sold stock. The UNIA sold stock in the company in a number of venues, at individual meetings, at conventions. Traveling agents went around to different communities and neighborhoods. There were mailed circulars, and the UNIA newspaper itself also advocated and encouraged people to buy stock in the Black Star Line. And people responded very enthusiastically. So much so that in that same year, in 1919, the Black Star Line is able to purchase its first ship, the SS Yarmouth. The Yarmouth is in not good enough shape. It's not the right kind of ship to go to Africa, to cross the Atlantic, but it very quickly starts making trips to the Caribbean, shipping goods back and forth between the United States and the Caribbean. And this Black Star Line, it really brings up the possibility of a more concrete transatlantic alliance built on industry, built on shared economic interests. And this vision was not simply Garvey's, but it was one shared by Africans in West Africa. There were many there who were interested in the possibilities of transatlantic shipping. By this time, remember, World War I has happened, and during the war and immediately afterwards, there was what West Africans had kind of endured some of the troubles of war as British colonial subjects. The British had a monopoly on shipping in British West Africa and had recently, during the war, raised shipping rates by 15%. And the African elites in British West Africa and in the Gold Coast welcomed the competition that the Black Star Line would have. The Black Star Line would represent another option for them to ship. And nationalist organizations like the Nationalist Congress of British West Africa, the first nationalist organization in British West Africa, urged Africans to buy shares in the Black Star Line as well. And just as with Garvey's election as provisional president of Africa, the Black Star Line too also exposed tensions within Pan-Africanism, as Africans, while encouraged and encouraging the Black Star Line, also wanted to be clear that it was their desire to not give away autonomy or control to African Americans. So one Gold Coast businessman, for instance, stated, "We have the controlling forces in our hands, and we in Africa alone understand these forces and can direct them right for the good of the whole race." So they welcomed investment as a way to fight economic power of Europeans, but there was still much tension over control and influence within whatever kind of economic arrangement there would be. These Pan-African alliances, in other words, were very fragile. But the Black Star Line very much did capture members' attention and imagination, and thousands of people went to the docks in New York to see the SS Yarmouth. And the Yarmouth was one of 3 ships that the Black Star Line purchased. The Black Star Line lasts for 3 years. In 1922, it closes due to large financial obligations, due to managerial errors, due to the unreliability of some of the people that Garvey entrusts to run the business, as well as government harassment. Remember I mentioned that one of the reasons that pan movements are threatening to nation states is they bring up this idea that of disloyalty, of dual loyalty. And so the director of what becomes the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, sees Garvey as a threat and as an agitator, and does what he can to hinder Garvey's efforts and to find something on him, to discredit him. Garvey is convicted of financial irregularities that had to do with selling of the stock in the Black Star Line. And he is sent to jail. In 1927, he is deported from the United States. The UNIA and its chapters continue. For instance, Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites, were members of a local Garvey chapters in East Lansing and in Omaha. And so the organization continues. And again, one of its largest impacts is in its efforts to increase what at the time was known as race pride and economic self-sufficiency. And that concludes what I wanted to say in class on Friday, February 27th. Hopefully what I've talked about has given some context to the documents and helped highlight some of the important aspects of both the Mexican Revolution and Pan movements. And we have Garvey's document that, again, is a vision of how to counter imperialism. We also have Cardenis's statement on the nationalization of the oil industries in Mexico, which for them was also a statement of countering foreign influence. When Cardenas announces oil nationalization, there is a large rally in Mexico City, for instance, with people holding signs saying that alas, Mexico has its financial independence, its economic independence. So arguing that previously Mexico had not been fully independent because its industries had been controlled by elsewhere, controlled from outside the country. Hopefully these 2 lectures, these videos have been helpful. And please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.